think we'll get rolling here. We've got a lot of great content for you guys today. Excited to talk about medical devices in Europe, busting myths and misconceptions. Before we get started, again, please ensure your audio is on mute and be sure to add your questions via the Q&A box. We'll be monitoring that during, and hopefully we'll have some time to get to questions at the end. And if we run out of time, we're happy to follow up with you afterwards. So be sure to post your questions in there, and we will also make the materials available as well as the recording after this webinar. So we'll just go from there. In case you're not familiar with Qualio, we are a cloud-based quality management system for life sciences companies. We serve both device and the pharmaceutical industries. Our system is quite flexible and very easy to use. And so welcome you to check out our website. And if you have more questions or want some more information about that, do let us know. We'll be happy to follow up with you after the webinar. All right, so I'm Kelly Stanton. I'm the Director of Quality here at Qualio. I've been in industry for lots of years now, 20-something, doing both medical device and pharmaceutical quality systems for startups, as well as having worked in some larger organizations. And joining me today, I'm very excited to introduce Andrew Witten, the Managing Director of Insight Regulatory. Andrew, tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, thanks, Kelly. So I'm Managing Director at Insight Regulatory, and we help medical device companies navigate regulatory requirements to achieve their business goals. So over the years, we've helped quite a wide range of companies with things like their regulatory strategies, through to achieving regulatory approvals. We help with quality management system implementation and maintenance, things like design and development processes, and supporting with testing and device assessments, and also with clinical development strategies and clinical data collection. So I've been working with medical devices for a similar amount of time, predominantly within a regulatory affairs sort of positions, but also within more R&D, design development side of things as well.
Awesome, thank you. Thanks for joining. Excuse me, goodness. Thanks for joining me today, Andrew. All right, so today's topic, common myths, misconceptions, and mistakes in European medical device compliance. It's a complex regulatory landscape over in Europe. Those of you who live there obviously are a little more used to how it works and dealing with all the different countries, different regulatory authorities, etc. And so we're excited to talk through some of those challenges, kind of debunk some of those misconceptions that we hear. And then hopefully have some time at the end for all of your wonderful questions that I know you'll be posting in our Q&A as we go along. All right, so common myths, misconceptions, and mistakes. Before we get rolling, we have a quick poll for you guys. We would like to know a little bit more about your current experience or understanding with products in Europe. So the poll should be up now. Please take a moment to answer that question for us, please. What is your current status with products in Europe? Do you have products in market? Are you working towards getting your products in market? Are you under MDR already? Are you still trying to transition? So if you would, please. I don't see lots of answers happening. If you guys could double check that window and answer those poll questions. Oh, there we go. Awesome, thank you. It looks like about 30% of you are in market and MDR compliant. 26% say you're in market and you're transitioning between MDD to MDR. 35%, so the largest amount of you aren't in market yet, but you're going for MDR. That's great. And there's a few of you who weren't quite sure what MDD or MDR was, so we'll try to touch on that topic and make sure everybody has a common understanding. All right, so Andrew, you want to take us off with European compliance, EU compliance, talking a little bit about the various states and non-member states as relates to the European Union?
Absolutely. So this is a very, very sort of common area that's get confused. So yeah, Europe is not the EU, so they're two different things. But predominantly, Europe does consist of well, a lot of EU member states. So as you can see on the map on the right, all the countries coloured in blue are EU member states, but there's also a number of other countries that are relevant within Europe. The sort of relevant ones we've got there, yeah, sort of Europe at the top. We've got Switzerland in the middle. You can, I think the arrows have come up in the middle of the body of blue. So their system is based on EU requirements, but not actually part of the EU. Jumping to the bottom, we've got Norway and Iceland, for example. They're members of the European Economic Area. So for all intents and purposes, it's worth considering them like they're part of the EU from a medical device legislation perspective. But you know, there's technically some differences there. And a big one I think we've spoken about with probably a few times before is how the UK requirements differ. So you'll see there the UK is no longer part of the EU, although the again the regulatory system is based on the old EU requirements. So if we go to the next slide, we can see it a bit more detail, I think. Oh, Kelly, can you go to? Oh yeah, thanks. Okay, so yeah, just a little bit of an overview on the different states. So you have EU at the top, and you know, sort of a lot of you would be more familiar with the requirements there. So it's based on CE marking, assessments conducted by notified bodies. For a lot of companies who are based outside, for companies who are based outside of the EU, there's an authorised representative that's required to be based within the EU. That's essentially as a sort of conduit of information between the manufacturer and the EU-based authorities and device users. Similarly, there's requirements within Switzerland which mirror the EU requirements, and CE marking is required for access to Swiss market. In Norway, again, it's very much the same system as in the EU as well, where following the EU legislation is required for the EU MDR and the IVDR at the moment. But within Great Britain, technically, you know, while it's as part of the UK, technically Great Britain, that has differed from the EU requirements. So in Great Britain, it's the UK medical device regulations that have to be followed, and they're essentially the old European directives. But if you're interested in all of these different territories, then and you're based outside there, you know, for example, in the US, then there's 3 different authorized representatives in one way or another that's required. So an EU authorized rep, a Swiss authorized rep, and a UK responsible person. So very much the same roles, but 3 separate entities that would be needed as a sort of conduit of information into those. And Switzerland, yeah, specifically, there's been quite a few changes there recently, with Switzerland requiring CE marking at the moment. The big change that happened end of last year, the Swiss Parliament voted to start the process to implement the acceptance of FDA, US FDA approved devices. So potentially an alternative route into the Swiss market there. That could be quite an interesting development as well. Yep, so yeah, we've done that slide. We go to the next one. So yeah, as a whole, we've got a bit of a patchwork within Europe. So no one system that covers everything, but predominantly based on EU systems. A lot of similarity there, but the devil's in the detail with a lot of it, and some sorts of differences could be quite significant as well. So it's really important to consider each one independently. And plus, there's other things that would tie in with this and have an impact. I mean, at the side, but there's a variety of other legislation that's enforced in the different territories that would potentially apply to different medical devices. So GDPR for things like software-based medical devices and things that handle information. And again, getting into detail, following the standards is a common theme across all the different areas, and a lot of them are international standards. But again, a lot of those also have subtle differences between what's required in the legislation and what's required in the standard as well. So yeah, very much a sort of, focus on each one independently. And yeah, and again, along the same lines, each, while the IVDR and the MDR, even within the EU, is supposed to attain a situation where there's a lot of similarity between the different member states and uniformity of how the requirements are being implemented. Very much like there has been in the past. There's lots of different territories that have their own specific requirements. At the moment, a lot of them seem to be based on sort of temporary positions while the UDAMED database is being implemented. So the UDAMED database, if you don't know, is a database that is required by the EU legislation for recording things like manufacturers and different devices that they supply to markets and clinical trials that they're conducting. Whereas the delays with UDAMED have meant that different countries have implemented their own rules as a sort of stopgap between now and then. But yeah, something to bear in mind if you're looking at studying in Europe, it's more than one country, and there are some additional requirements. So yes, in conclusions, there's just despite certain amount of similarity, there's a lot of differences between all the different territories, and a strategy to sell a device into Europe should take into account all those different ones, especially places like Switzerland and the UK, where there's more specific differences. But yeah, there's also ability to sell predominantly across the majority of Europe with the CE marking routes for now, anyway.
All right. Well, I feel like we've covered sort of high-level overview. Let's dive into some of those myths. Okay. First one: do we need to apply for renewal of our EU MDD certificate if it expires before the MDR deadline? Andrew, what do you think on this one?
I think it's going to be a no. Yeah, there we go. That's straightforward, wasn't it? So there's no process for renewing MDD certificates. So when they expire from now on, or if they have already expired, there's no way to renew them. So notified bodies aren't allowed to do that. But they do stay valid up until their expiry, and actually beyond them now as well, due to the most recent change. But there's definitely conditions with that. There can't be any significant changes to the device, which does cover a lot of design changes to the indications and intended purpose and things like that. Yes, so that will help a lot of manufacturers to make that change, but there's still not a lot of time with that. We'll cover that a bit more later on anyway.
Yep, sounds good. All right. So if we only manufacture accessories for medical devices, not any medical devices themselves, we don't need a CE mark, do we? I know the answer to this one. Yes, you still do need a CE mark, because while accessories aren't medical devices on their own, and they're generally manufactured separately from the assembled and finished devices they support, if they're still CE marked, they're individually classified. Andrew, anything to add to that one?
Yeah, just following on from your last point. Yeah, we often see sort of incorrect assumption that the classification of the medical device is going to be, or the classification of the accessory is the same as the medical device, but that's not the case. They're often, they're often different, but they're assessed separately. And quite often the accessory is of a lower class than the device, but that's not always the case.
Yeah, lower class does not mean unclassified. I feel like that's the important thing to emphasize there is, perhaps it couldn't be used. I've tried to have this argument with folks before too. Well, it can't be used by itself. Like, that's nice. It's still, needs to be classified and managed as a standalone unit with its various design files, et cetera, et cetera. We don't need to add our EU authorized representative to our device labeling. Another good myth. I've heard this one. But it depends, right, Andrew? If the label's not large enough to include that information, you've got to have it in there somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's the same with a lot of information that's required on the label. If you have a small device with a small label, you can't fit it all on, then you can put some of that on the packaging or potentially in the IFU. But yeah, there's things like the authorized rep name and address, probably one of the first things you could remove. But with things like these, another myth kind of going along with this is that if there's a lot of marketing information on your product label, then there's no information that's left behind. Then you can take off that essential information, put it elsewhere. That's not usually the case. It's the critical information that's required by the directives and the regulations need to go on there. Otherwise, you can't make space for marketing blurbs and claims and things like that if you've taken off the crucial information. But yes, if it's a small device, small label, you can take off some stuff.
Yep. All right. Yet another myth. We need to only report direct patient injury or harm caused by our device to the relevant competent authority. Oh boy, yeah. Injury reporting. There's a hot, slippery mess of lots of places to get into trouble if you do this wrong. So no, you still have to report. Indirect harm caused by your device still must be reported. Examples include misdiagnosis, delayed diagnosis treatment, inappropriate treatment, or lack of treatment. Even events where there's little or no consequence for the patient, but there could be if the event recurred, you still must report these things. And I think we talk a little bit later, there's been some changes around some of these regulations depending on what market you're in. And I think the other thing I recall when I was personally responsible for this sort of activity for a global company here in the US was that you also need to pay attention, very close attention, to which countries want to know only the things that happen in their country versus which countries want to know the things that happen with the device being marketed in their market anywhere in the world. Because those things can get you into trouble if you think, oh, well, this happened in Poland, it only needs to be reported in Poland. That may or may not be true.
Yeah, absolutely. And I say, even with the changes that happened with the move from the MDD to the MDR, for example, a lot of these sort of misconceptions are still the same. So yeah, there's obviously a lot of manufacturers would sort of prefer not to report any events that happen. But again, that's not always sort of meeting the requirements of the legislation. So yeah, exactly. Indirect harm, or the main one is the bit at the bottom there, where if something hadn't resulted in significant harm when it first occurred, if that was just by luck and next time it could result in harm, then that kind of thing is reportable as well. So yeah, it's a lot of misconceptions about when not to report. And other thing that we see a lot as well, so user error is often used as an excuse not to, or a reason not to report, but that's not an adequate reason in itself.
No, absolutely not. No, user errors absolutely need to be reported, and you need to make sure that those are being fed back into your risk management system. Because if you see repeat use of certain kinds of user errors, for example, you're going to want to have an answer for what you're doing about that, for sure. So I've seen that one go sideways. All right. The Unique Device Identification System, UDI, encompasses all medical devices in the EU now. Almost. So still transitioning, still bringing this system fully online. It's been quite a few years now, it feels like, Andrew.
Yeah, I think we're most of the way through it now. The last requirements, basically from an EU MDR and IVDR perspective, are the labeling on the device, on the device packaging. So most devices, or all devices, need most devices need a UDI, but from next month, class 2s will also need that to be on the device packaging, and then from 2025, it's going to be class 1 devices as well need that. But yeah, class 3s already do need that on their packaging. But yeah, there's a couple of device types that don't. Custom-made and investigational devices don't, and also legacy devices. So products that are MDD or IVDD compliant, that making use of that transition period, they don't need a UDI. For those devices until they become MDR or IVDR compliant.
All right. The sell-off means all our old MDD certified devices can no longer be supplied after 26 May 2025. update here, right? The EU just canceled the sell-off period. Any of your devices with an old MDD certificate already in the supply chain at the end of the new transition period can still be supplied without any time restriction. So that's good news.
It is, yeah. Good help. I think what's important here is the sort of definitions that apply to it before that date, device, or before the devices need to be placed on the market, which means sort of a commitment to sell the product to an entity within the EU, and then they can actually that sort of sale can be completed and the supply of the devices can occur after that. But yeah, now there's no longer a sort of a limit on that, so that can be very useful for a lot of manufacturers.
Definitely. All medical devices for sale in the EU need to be assessed by a notified body. Well, I think all being the key word here, so then the answer is no. However, you're definitely going to want to make sure that you've carefully considered your classification here.
Yep. So same as before, the sort of lowest risk devices, don't need a notified body, but a lot of them do. And I think the crucial thing here is that more devices need a notified body than used to under the directives, especially from an IVD perspective as well. There's a majority of devices didn't need a notified body in the past, but will do going forward. So yeah, that's a big change. But yeah, definitely not all of them.
Yep. Well, and it's always interesting to me too. I think people sometimes fall into the trap of, but this is definitely a low risk device, except it's sterile, or except it can be reused, right? So as soon as you start trying to get into the whole, like, reusable seems to be a place where, in my experience, I've run into the most wrong assumptions, I guess, around how those need to be treated. People think, wow, you can just, you just clean it and use it again. Like, yeah, there's a whole lot behind that. And yeah, it would be a more complicated path forward. All right, let's talk about timelines then. So the MDR transition period was extended again by the European Parliament in January of this year, so January 2023, after a very overwhelming 537-3 vote. However, there's still going to be quite a lot to get done in that time if you haven't already started.
Yeah, quite a subjective term. Yeah, there's a lot of time depending on how you look at it, isn't it? So so these are new timelines. So I think this table shows both the IVD transition timelines, which weren't just updated but still relevant, and then on the left are the new medical device timelines as well. So you've got class 3 custom made devices to that 26th of May 2026, but the probably the most relevant ones to most people would be for either sort of higher risk or lower risk products. It's either going to be end of 2027 or the end of 2028. So it seems like a long way off, but potentially for a lot of manufacturers, there's a lot of work to do in that time. And I suppose beyond that, it's important to remember that the extended transition timelines aren't directly applicable to all devices. So, for example, if a device's MDD certificate had expired before the 20th of March this year, then it's not so straightforward. They would have had to have a contract signed with the notified body before that date, and an agreement with the competent authority for supplying the device, during that. In the meantime as well, before the regulation was updated. So there could be some products that aren't covered by this. And still, one thing we quite often see as well, assumption that it applies to all devices, but like it was before, for any product that doesn't need a notified body under the MDR or the IVDR, these transition timelines don't apply. So for Class 1 general devices and Class A non-sterile, so Class 1 non-sterile, non-measuring, non-reusable surgical equipment, and for Class A IVDs that aren't sterile, no notified bodies required under the new regulations, so those should be compliant with the new regulations already, or from the date those regulations came into force. So no transition period there. And also with all these transition periods, same thing applies as before. The manufacturers need to follow the MDR or IVDR requirements for vigilance, post-market surveillance, and registration. But other things like need for PRRC, person responsible for regulatory compliance, and things like that don't apply, from the MDR requirements. So it would definitely help a lot of manufacturers. But I think we'll go on to the next slide. There's a few dates before then as well. So yeah, the transition timeline extension is based on these three dates sort of requirements. So to make use of those additional extensions to the transition periods till 2027 or 2028, manufacturers will need to hit these dates as well for getting a QMS in place, having an application with notified body accepted, and then having that written agreement with the notified body as well. So they're during the year next year. So that's not too far off. So I mean, for example, the QMS side of things, leaving that until 2028 or 2027 is obviously not going to happen. We're not going to be acceptable.
Definitely. All right. So yeah, I think Andrew, you were going to take us through some of this content around the notified body lists as well. As notified bodies, they're having to recertify as these different regulations change and stuff. Do I understand that correctly?
That's it. Yeah. So all notified bodies want to be notified bodies against the new regulations, have to be notified against those regulations. So that's been a big process for all of those as well. And you see on the right, we're still going through this process of notified bodies becoming re-notified or notified against the new regulations. But it's obviously a slow process, and where we had far more notified bodies against the old directives, there's far fewer currently against the new regulations. But it's growing, almost on a month-by-month basis. Something else to bear in mind with notified bodies as well is that while they might maybe approve their the scope of their activities may sort of have decreased, so there may be certain types of devices that they can no longer review and provide certificates for as well. So manufacturers have to bear that in mind as well. And obviously, there's a lot of other manufacturers in the same queues to get their products certified against the MDR. So it's about getting on that waiting list as soon as possible, and getting the documentation in front of the notified body in a good enough state that they can approve it as quick as they can. Because I think on a previous slide, looking at the timelines for getting a product from start to approval is quite a long process. So yeah, 2027, 2028 will come around very quickly. I think on the next slide, if you skip to that, we've got so okay, could you skip to the next slide, please, Kelly?
All right. So one of the other topics we wanted to be sure to discuss with you guys today was that going through this whole process is a business project. This isn't something that regulatory just goes off and does in a silo. Your design group kind of goes off in their little silo. This is a complex project and business problem to be solved, and you're going to want to make sure that your quality and regulatory teams are actively involved along the way in the various stages of the project and the processes, because especially with some of the moving targets around some of the requirements in the various markets, those teams are going to be best positioned to bring those bits of information or changes back into your project team as you guys are moving along towards getting a product in market and making sure that the documentation is adequate and meets the requirements in the various different markets that you intend to go into. And so, yeah, you're going to want to make sure that you've got a nice cross-functional team that's meeting on the regular and not not operating in silos. You don't want to get all the way to the end with your design project and then have the regulatory team come back and tell you there were 2 or 3 other things that were missed, and it will just delay your timelines.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we see that a lot from a consultancy perspective. I mean, there's companies for one reason or another, either can't or don't sort of get as involved in the regulatory sort of activities and quality management system activities, and sort of pass it on to a consultant to try and sort of handle, in isolation. But those projects, invariably take a lot longer than ones where the manufacturer is, really engaged and really involved. And exactly like you're saying, Kelly, all different levels of the business are involved because the requirements do touch every part of the business. And at some point, there'll be a bottleneck or things won't progress because that one part of the business hasn't been involved. So yeah, it will come around at some point. But yeah, we definitely see a difference in speed that projects happen with those 2 different situations.
Definitely. Well, and then another big myth around any of this is that legacy quality systems will get us through. So if you're in a position where your device has changed classification or has now become classified and it wasn't before, I think people have a lot of sort of, there's a lot of misunderstanding around what's required for a quality system. And so you're going to want to make sure that you get off of paper. Everybody's requiring electronic submissions these days. There's no reason to be running a quality system on paper in a facility. In a remote world where a lot of us are remote anymore, obviously those things aren't possible, but there's a great business case to be made for getting off of paper with your quality system to support all of these activities. Really does speed things up and make things much easier to manage. And we can throw a lot of numbers and a lot of stats, but the reality is that you are wasting time and money and you're wasting resources if you're staying on paper. It really isn't the faster, easier way to get in market. And so as you're going to go through, I think most people operating in Europe know, or operating under ISO, that you have to have a quality system in place before you can even do your technical file activity. Which is a bit opposite for us here in the States. And here in the US, we can go a very long way. We can get a product all the way into market without having a complete quality system in place, which is a little mind-boggling to me, to be honest, but it's the reality of the way our regulations work. But again, I can't emphasize enough, if you haven't been classified or your device is changing classification, part of your getting to market strategy needs to be a solid assessment of the state of your quality system and whether or not it's scalable and sustainable to carry you forward with these projects. And so wanted to share a quick case study on going digital wherever possible. So In Vivo Bionics is operating under 13485 and EU MDR. They were able to mitigate one full-time salary from the bottom line. So again, you don't have to have people just to manage the paper. Makes a big difference. And they were able to double their speed into the market, shorten their timelines significantly, and get themselves distributing products quickly. So again, with the timelines and things going on, if you don't yet have your quality system in place, this can be going on in parallel and supporting your timelines through the rest of the processes necessary to get you into market. So while things are going on as far as your clinical studies, your collection of your essential requirements documentation, all of those sorts of things, you've already got your document control processes made fully electronic and able to support this. This really will, I can't emphasize enough how you can speed up in this by staying off paper. And going forward too, as you get into market, you're going to have to demonstrate that you've got processes in place to support post-market surveillance activities, complaint handling, et cetera, et cetera. And so getting all of this in place as you're going along will mean that you're ready to hit the ground running when you do finally get that approval. All right, so we did have a few questions come in. Let me start rattling those off. First question, how can it be possible that two different notified bodies classify the same product differently? Example, class 2A and class 2B.
That's interesting.
Andrew, have you seen this much? I haven't seen this very much.
No, yeah, over the years it happens now and again. I mean, it can happen. I mean, when devices are classified, according to the classification rules, there's a certain amount of sort of interpretation and sort of subjectivity sometimes to some of these, and sometimes it can boil down to sort of quite a complex sort of clinical sort of clinical point of view on something like that. And if you have two independent notified bodies, independent groups looking at the same classification, you could with some of these very subjective and very sort of borderline essentially decisions, you could end up with two different answers. So and especially between 2A and 2B, that there's quite a few classification rules where that could happen. I don't see don't see it too often, but it can happen. There are, I suppose, mechanisms to resolve that, and especially within the MDR, then there's a medical device coordination group. I think that's one of their responsibilities to help sort of adjudicate on certain disagreements between manufacturers and notified bodies. So yeah.
All right. Do all accessories need to be included in a device's IFU, especially for class 3 devices?
Yeah. So there's a requirement to put products that the device works with or would interact with, to put those into the IFU. There could be examples where that's not possible. I mean, I think Kelly, you'd sort of touched on this a little bit before, but a accessory and a medical device, it's an accessory too, are quite often manufactured by different manufacturers, and it might be the case that the medical device manufacturer isn't overly aware of isn't aware of the accessory. So it might be a case that they don't know about it enough to put it into the IFU for the medical device itself. But yeah, generally, if there's information required to operate the medical device safely and effectively, then that needs to go in the IFU. And a lot of the main accessories probably would be known to the medical device manufacturer.
I would think so too, because even if how common it would be the scenario where you had something that was meant to use together, but maybe those two companies, like, there's still a submission that puts those two together. So the sponsor or the holder of that, wouldn't they be required to make those references and pull those things in?
Yeah, potentially. I mean, it definitely, it's a bit more of a one-way street. I mean, the accessory needs to reference the medical device, but it may not always be possible for the medical device to reference the accessory, especially now with the definition of accessory being a bit broader. I mean, it's not just, I can't remember exactly what it is, but I think it also now includes assist the medical device in achieving its intended purpose or something like that. So it may be possible for a medical device to be placed on the market without the need of an accessory to sort of assist its use, and then that accessory is added later on, and the manufacturer may not be aware of the manufacturer of the medical device may not be aware of them until a little bit later anyway. So it could happen, but yeah, that's where post-market surveillance would be useful, and the manufacturer of the original medical device probably would find out about the range of accessories before too long.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. Let's see. Can EU distributors continue to sell their inventory that they have in stock if the manufacturer no longer has a CE mark on the product? They had the stock prior to the CE mark being canceled.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So then it gets back to what I was saying before about the definitions of being placed on the market and put into service and things like that. So if an EU distributor already has it's in their inventory, it's been placed on the market. So I suppose the transition provisions within the MDR are going to be relevant here, and my understanding is that it's not a requirement for them to continue to be sort of supplied. from a distributor and sort of downstream in that sort of supply chain, if the C certificate is no longer valid, is that placing on the market, from memory, that requires that C certificate to be valid? But actually, it might be a good one to check on and get back to the person asking.
Okay. All right. Let's see. If I've understood correctly, the sell-off period was only dependent on whether the product was contracted to sell for a particular period.
Okay. Sell for a particular period. So in the with the previous requirements, there was one deadline for placing a device on the market, which is the point when the manufacturer essentially agrees on the sort of transfer of ownership to a importer or a distributor within the EU. So the device needs to be manufactured, and that sort of agreement to supply the device or to sell the device has to be made. So then the sell-off period, maybe a bit of a sort of misnomer, is when that device could actually continue to be supplied or actually provided to that distributor or importer. So yeah, with that, it would have been probably as part of the agreement to purchase the device, some kind of requirements about the time period for that purchase, but I don't think it was a specific requirement that it had to state that. I mean, previously the rules were that it had to be provided, actually sort of supplied to that distributor or importer before the date in 2025, and that's what's been removed.
Okay, gotcha. According to the MDR, you should classify a cleaning agent as a medical device. What about REACH regulation EC number 1907/2006? You have to comply with these two regulations, and that means a lot of work for the manufacturing companies.
Okay, so I'm not a REACH expert, but from memory, REACH doesn't apply to medical devices. So when something meets the definition of a medical device, REACH regulations don't apply. But I'm guessing here there may be the manufacturer may supply one cleaning product as both a medical device and as a sort of more of a general cleaning product. So yeah, if you have two products, or one labeled as cleaning endoscope or something, for example, and then obviously that would make that cleaning product a medical device. You have one use of it there, and it may be used for cleaning some other kind of industrial equipment, for example. It wouldn't be a medical device for that use, but then REACH requirements would apply. So basically, you've got sort of one product labeled in two different ways and two different sets of regulations that apply. But yeah, unfortunately, both would apply, and sets of hoops would have to be jumped through, I suppose.
Yeah. As I say, the thought I had is I would probably look to distribute the same product. I'd label, one set one way and one set the other way. But I can't imagine that the regulations would be massively different. I mean, as far as like manufacturing and quality system support and those kinds of things, that might be,
yeah,
I don't know, that might be an interesting one to dive into a little more detail on.
Yeah, I mean, the device regulations will probably, obviously every case is different, but yeah, the device regulations may cover a lot of it as well. But yeah, there's different labeling requirements and things like that anyway. So yeah.
Yep. Speaking of sell-off period, what about software as a service medical devices? When do we consider the product is in the pipeline?
Oh, that's an interesting point. Okay. Yeah, so obviously all the rules are sort of written predominantly in mind of physical devices, not software devices. Okay, so back to those sort of definitions I was talking about before. You've got when it's placed on the market, and that's again when it's committed to being sold or transferred to a user. It has to be manufactured at that point, and that's probably the interesting point of when that's the case. No, actually, so it's a good point. Maybe one to get back on as well. Actually, I'd say probably the product would, in a lot of cases, maybe have to be with the end user for that to be the case. I'd have to.
Yeah, I would think I would define that as: do you have have you sold it? Are you selling it? Do you have then it's definitely in market at that point.
Yeah. No, I think, I mean, the requirement to the sort of physical financial transaction doesn't have to be completed for it to be placed on the market, but yeah, there has to be sort of a strong commitment for that sale to go through, and the device also has to be manufactured, which from a software perspective generally means that there's that version of the software has been produced and is available. So that's probably the point at which it's been placed on the market, and then yeah, the set-off period would take it through until that the end user actually has the software set up and functioning as well. So I think that's probably the appropriate way to define it in a time period. And obviously with the sell-off period now not being so relevant or relevant at all, it is that commitment to sell and the software version being sort of in place and being sort of ready to be supplied. That's probably the appropriate definition.
Okay. Equivalence demonstrations are still accepted as a method to demonstrate compliance, or requires the MDR, or does requirements under the MDR, I'm sort of filling in here, also a clinical evaluation consultation by an independent expert panel?
Okay, so it's good. A couple of questions here. So yeah, so we're talking about excuse me, equivalence. I'm guessing we're talking about clinical evaluation. So yes, so clinical data on, well, and again, this is for medical devices, not for IVDs. So clinical data on equivalent devices is or are still accepted as a way to demonstrate the safety and performance of the medical device that you're manufacturing. But yeah, it's harder to do. So the requirements for demonstrating equivalence were updated, so they're stricter generally in most areas. So it's harder to demonstrate. But yeah, if equivalence to another device that's already on the market can be demonstrated, then any available clinical data on that other device is it's able to be used and leveraged for conformity assessment of the device that you're working on. In terms of sort of myths and misconceptions, one thing we do see a lot is there are two, like I was saying, two parts to that. Demonstrating equivalence is the first part, and then the second part is actually obtaining the data on the other device as well. So if you have an equivalent device where the manufacturer or where there's no published clinical data or no clinical data available, then that's not not a viable way forward. It's not going to help really. The other thing with this as well, one of the big changes with the MDR is that most Class 2B implantable and all Class 3 devices, if equivalence wants to be used, then there needs to be a specific contract in place, agreement in place between the manufacturer of the new device and the manufacturer of the equivalent device, that the equivalent device manufacturer will share the technical documentation on an ongoing basis with the new device manufacturer. And for most setups where there's no direct link between the two manufacturers, that's not going to happen. So it kind of kills it for those kind of products. So that's the first part. The second part, clinical evaluation consultation. Yes, there are certain device types that do require clinical evaluation consultation procedures. So high risk devices, certain high risk devices would require the notified body to conduct their assessment of the clinical documentation, the clinical evaluation predominantly, and then getting assessment from the independent panel to agree with their assessment or otherwise, and then the notified body has to take that into account when issuing any CE certificates.
Okay. Can you provide the MDR's definition of an accessory? I know it is not what we in the US commonly consider an accessory.
We could do, yeah. I could read it out if that helps. It's basically any device which let me go back to the thing here. Any device which assists or allows the medical device functionality of a medical device. Hang on a minute, let me. One thing we don't know off the top of my head.
Sure. Well, and then the follow-on question to that would be, would the accessory then need its own technical file if it's designed after the main device, or can it be included in the current main device's technical file?
Yeah. Okay. I've got a definition here. So it's any article. So it's not a medical device. I'm sort of skipping to the relevant bits. So it's intended by its manufacturer to be used together with one or several other medical devices. And this is the relevant bit to specifically enable the medical device to be used in accordance with its intended purpose, or assist it to do that essentially as well. So it enables, or basically to paraphrase, it enables or assists the medical device to achieve its intended purpose. So yeah, that definitely is different from the US definition. And generally, we found the definition of an accessory in the US is somewhat broader than in the EU. So you quite often have a product that would be considered an accessory in the US, and the exact same system or exact same product wouldn't be considered an accessory in the EU as well. So generally is considered a bit more, a bit broader with that. And there's some good guidance from the FDA on that, I think, from the US perspective. So okay, so with an accessory, so yeah, presumably we're talking here about, from a technical file perspective, you've got the same manufacturer of the medical device and the accessory as well. So yeah, so very much they can be included in the same technical file, but it's usually we normally recommend it's sort of decided on a case-by-case basis and what works best. One of the main things that mean, obviously, if the medical device and the accessory are made by different manufacturers, they're not going to be in the same technical file, obviously. What the other thing that we normally find would sort of mean it doesn't make sense to put them in the same technical file is if they're different classifications. And that's quite often the case. So yeah, then potentially you might have a class 2A medical device and a class 1 accessory. There's no point putting your accessory generally in the technical file with the class 2A device. Then you need potentially need that to be the whole thing reviewed by the notified body, and it just sort of complicates the review. So they're kind of reasons why you wouldn't do that. But yeah, generally, if they're a lot of the supporting data is separate for the two different products, then shoehorning them into the same technical file doesn't always make sense. But other times, it could be a case that clinical data collected on the use of on the medical device itself actually supports the accessory as well, and it's quite an easy add-on. So there are cases when putting them two together in the same technical file can make sense and is easier. But yeah, it's really a case-by-case basis. It'll be fine.
Well, we just had another question come in along those lines too. So if you have another manufacturer for the same product with the same classification, do you need another technical file?
Another manufacturer, same product, same case.
So is this like alternate supplier situation? I think it probably depends. In my experience, I've handled these under the same, if it's the same product using the same design files, then there's another, I'm just bringing another manufacturer online to have alternate sources for product. Historically, I've managed that in one technical file with the two different suppliers, just as because they're under your supplier qualification program. And then the rest of, any additional documentation between the two would be around equivalence between the two manufacturers, right?
Yeah. Okay, yeah, so I think you manufacturer, like the legal manufacturer, but now if you're talking subcontract manufacturer, then yeah, definitely. I think I can't think I've seen an example where the same product, with the same design, same intended purpose, and everything like that, we had two different suppliers. You would you then have two different technical files from those. Yeah, they generally be put in the same technical file. There might be some weird and wonderful examples, yeah, where there would need two files, but yeah, predominantly it wouldn't be.
Yeah, I don't think I wouldn't go to the effort of generating a whole separate technical file unless something was very different. Like if you had something very different about your manufacturing process or something very different about your materials, or if your old technical file was just completely inadequate kind of situation, you had like an old grandfathered. I've seen a lot of that where the tech file itself is pretty old, but I mean, with all the changes and bringing everything up to MDR, I think you'd be going back through and updating all of that anyway. Yeah. So I think in general, then the answer would be no, you don't. But there are certainly situations where it might be appropriate to manage it that way. But to me, that just feels like a lot more work.
Yeah.
All right, well, we have answered all the questions. Thank you all so much for joining us today. It's been a lovely conversation, and thank you for all your great questions. We've enjoyed this Q&A session here at the end. And yeah, be sure to watch your email. We'll send out the presentation, and feel free to ping Andrew and I on LinkedIn. We're around. We love interacting with you guys. And I hope you have a really great rest of your day. Thank you so much for joining us today.